All right, I'll call us to order. It's 6:07 p.m. Welcome to the April 10th meeting of the Planning and Transportation Commission of the City of Palo Alto. Can we do a roll call?
Vice Chair Alchick. Commissioner Lowing.
Present.
Chair Riggs.
Present.
Commissioner Rupavar.
Present.
Commissioner Suma.
Present.
Commissioner Templeton.
Present.
And Commissioner Waldfogel. All 7 present.
All right, so oral communications. I believe we have one speaker, Ms. Gardner. 3 minutes, Ms. Gardner.
Thank you. I'm Liz. I live at 2500 El Camino Real, and tonight I just wanted to speak on the mechanical lifts, parking lifts. I just wanted to support that it's not a solution to limited space parking flexibilities, especially not for residential parking. They break down frequently. Our company, Klaus, it's located in Walnut Creek. It's a 2-hour minimum drive to get to a property to fix the lift. If you want to order parts, they come from overseas, and it accommodates limited autos. That's no motorcycles, utility vehicles, minivans. There's no ADA handicap parking. It's not recommended for families with children, especially infants and toddlers, and or for busy working families. Ours breaks frequently, and my son was late one evening for a school presentation. He was very upset. We had to take Lyft. The second time it broke, he was late for school, and there was no excuse tardy for a broken lift. So I just really wanted to make sure that mechanical lifts are not especially used for residential parking in the city of Palo Alto. I think if you had an on-site attendant 24/7, that would be a different story. But again, you know, our property was not going to reimburse us for those 2 Lyft rides. He was late, 2 different. And the other important fact is if it breaks, other people cannot get in and out of the lift. So that means that people can, are vulnerable to getting dinged at work, fired, especially for low-income properties where people are really already struggling and trying to hang on to the jobs they have. So that's about it. Any questions? I'm an expert with the lifts.
Thank you, Ms. Gardner. All right, so seeing no further comments, we'll go to agenda changes and deletions. We do have one announcement. We're going to postpone item number 2 to a future date. For context, we on the commission had a February retreat, and we talked about all the different ways where we were interested in seeing innovation and creative solutions in Palo Alto, and particularly with regard to transportation as a first priority and housing implementation as a second priority. We had a couple members of the public show up for that. And it was a very productive meeting, and one of the things that we came up with was that we could have co-education sessions where we actually allow people to come and educate us and the public about innovations in the sector. This was supposed to be one of the first times we'd done that. We had scheduled to have Mr. Evan Golden come in, who's basically spent an entire career charting transportation innovation and has some interesting ideas about parking inventory management. Due to an omission in the packet, we're going to need to reschedule that. And so I know we had a couple people here for that. Apologies for that. And also to the council members and the mayor who were interested and eager to have us have these creative and idea-driven dialogues. So maybe I'll ask that we not editorialize as a commission and not try to figure out what went wrong, but just to perform better next time and make sure we can have this kind of creative dialogue in the future. Any other suggested additions, deletions, anything from staff? Okay, with that, that said, we have a study session, we have a public hearing on 1210 Newell Road, request for hearing on director's tentative decision to deny a variance and request to allow for an exception from the standard corner lot fence with a height regulations for an unpermitted fence of approximately 7 foot 5 inches in the front yard, where 6 foot is allowed, 8 foot in the rear yard, where 7 foot is allowed, 7 foot 5 inches in the interior yard, where 7 foot is allowed, and 7 foot 5 inches on the street yard with no site triangle reduction at the Newell Road and Community Lane intersection. This project is exempt from CEQA, and I'll let staff take it away from there.
Great, thanks, Chair. Sam Gutierrez will make the presentation this evening, and we're also joined by Jody Gerhardt, who is the planning manager for the current planning program. Sam?
Thank you. Good evening to the commission members here. Just jump into the presentation. We'll start with this is just a street elevation view of the existing site and the existing conditions as is. Just to give you a brief overview of the project here, this was initially started as a code enforcement case. Last summer, we did an investigation. A notice of violation was sent out. There was some discussions with the property owner about options and what to do to correct the issues, and the property owner chose to go with a variance, which was submitted in August. After discussions and reviewing the variance application, we sent out a tentative denial January of this year, and the property owner did make a timely request for hearing, so here we are. And also, just to keep in mind, this is a single-family residential zone, and the house that is currently on site is newly constructed. So just to go over a bit of the variance, remember the purpose of the variance here is to give some flexibility to a property owner that has some type of specific constraints for a number of reasons. It could be the site size, it could be possibly trees or some water course that is unique to that property, and applying zoning or other sections of the code would be difficult there. It would actually hinder them more than similar properties in the area. And of course, a variance does require findings. All findings must be met, and if we don't meet one of the findings, then a variance cannot be approved. There are a number of findings. I summarized them here in the 3 bullet points. Again, special circumstances of the property could hinder that property from enjoying the privileges that other properties in the same district can enjoy. Also, we want to be sure that we aren't granting a variance that now makes that property have special privileges far beyond what other properties enjoy. And then, of course, the granting a variance wouldn't be, detrimental to public safety, health, welfare, and convenience. So those are a summary of the required findings. Here's the photos of the existing conditions from all angles. You can see, again, the street view, front side of the home. The second picture in the upper right, you can see the Newell Road street-facing side. You can see the fence that's existing. And then a zoomed-in photo of that same fence on the lower left. And then the lower right is the backyard fence that runs along Community Lane, which is the alley behind this property. Here's a map of the vicinity. You can see the property there, indicated with the little pin drop, and our public tennis courts that are across from Rinconada Library. And there you can see here that a number of properties actually back up to the tennis courts as well, not just this one property. And you could also see Community Lane, how it cuts through the rear portion of these properties. Just to give you a brief overview of the zoning, this is a standard R1 zone, so 6,000 square foot lot is the minimum. This property is over that, over 9,000 square feet. So it's a large property in consideration of the R1 zone. as we move on here, we could compare what is permitted per the fence code versus what's existing. The fences are over all of the required fence sizes. And this would be the illustration of what would be permitted on site. This is a standard corner lot fence regulation diagram, and you could see here with the red kind of outline that's superimposed on this image, that's the footprint roughly of the house and where the larger fences would normally go and where the smaller fences should be, which currently are occupied by the larger existing fence. And also there's a depiction of the site triangle on the top portion of this image, which applies to corners and intersections. Of course, this property has a community lane running along the rear, so that changes this image a little bit where we have to have a site triangle here as well. This is that corner intersection that I was referring to earlier with Community Lane and Newell Road. The existing fence is over 7 feet tall, and it goes right to the public right-of-way, the sidewalk, and the community lane that runs along the rear. And you can see here how tall it is. This is a breakdown of community lane as it intersects the sidewalk and Newell Road and where the site triangle should be. And here you can see from the pedestrian perspective, if you're standing here on this right image, this would be your approach towards Community Lane and the tennis court facility. You don't really have a large line of sight at all. Whereas if you stand on the other side, you have more line of sight. As you can see, this fence that we do have at our public facility is offset, pulled back, so it does grant a bit more view. This is a requirement in the code because we do want to have this site triangle to avoid collision points and allow pedestrians, cyclists, or anyone driving enough time to react as another car is coming. So that is depicted here in these images. You can see the vehicle A and vehicle B. This sight line is this sight line triangle, and that would be the point where it would allow these two moving vehicles to have a reaction point. They could see a car approaching and they know to slow down. And this is also further depicted in these triangles here. This one's for a driveway, this one's for an intersection. And furthermore here in this lower right photo, you could see that if the site triangle is offset further back, then these two moving vehicles would have a greater time to see one another and react, where if the site triangle doesn't exist, you're almost at the collision point already. And that's what this image here essentially shows is the existing condition. You have vehicles there, you have bicyclists, and you have pedestrians. So as they're heading towards the tennis court facilities on Newell, you have this conflict point here, and that is a requirement in the fence code to have these reduction in fence heights in this area, so then it allows this site triangle to exist, and then you have a minimized collision point. So the key consideration is that we couldn't make findings in the affirmative for all of the required variance findings for this fence as is. There was no modifications to it. So it was difficult to make a finding that the property is unique and is somehow restricted. The other finding is the safety finding that's required and convenience to public health and safety, because there is no site triangle and you can actually not request a variance for the site triangle. The code specifically says that you cannot ask for a variance from that. So that was another problem with the variance findings. We couldn't make that finding as well because of that. So as we move forward, we also did present some options to the property owner. There's the options of, putting the code-compliant fences, and if they have a concern about privacy, there's also hedges that you could put behind the code-compliant fences that now would create a privacy screen. There's also the potential for the site triangle to be, somehow changed in the sense of that the fence would be cut down but pushed back, and they could plant hedges along there and still maintain a privacy screen. There was a lot of concern about privacy towards their rear yard, and they said, if you bring down the fence for the site triangle, I don't have that anymore, but that's not quite true. You have still the ability to have hedges planted at a higher point than the code-compliant fence, as long as it's outside of the site triangle. So these options were discussed with the property owner as well. So we do recommend that the Planning and Transportation Commission take the following actions. Recommend that the council deny the variance request based on the project's inability to meet the required findings. And that ends the presentation. The applicant has prepared a presentation as well.
Good evening. My name is Derek Longstaff. I'm an attorney at practice here in Palo Alto. Thank you for taking the time to hear from me on behalf of my clients, Chin Yao Chu and Cindy Zhang, who's here with me. I'd also like to, if it's okay, have Ms. Zhang make a very brief statement at the end of my statements here. First and foremost, I have to say, the principal problem here is a matter of legal interpretation, and it goes to Municipal Code Section 16.24.040. Unfortunately, I have no idea if the city attorney has reviewed our interpretation of this code section. I have no knowledge as to whether or not the city attorney has advised this body of our arguments. The code upon which planning relies exclusively is specifically states that a vision corner, this vision triangle, which was basically the entire presentation, is required in a case where a street is improved for vehicular traffic. Community lane does allow cars to go down it. However, in reading the code in context, it is not a street improved for vehicular traffic. And the definition upon which the city relies states, a street is anything that includes courts, places, squares, curbs, or other public ways. That is taken from 1.04.050. Again, it would be more useful for this body had planning offered to have the city attorney render a legal opinion. The definition of street upon which the applicant relies states that a street is a highway, thoroughfare, parkway, road, or avenue, and it specifically states it does not include an alleyway or driveway. Planning has told us that community lane is considered an alley. If an alley is not a street under Palo Alto Municipal Code Section 21.04.30, then this code section does not apply. Secondarily, this condition of a 6-foot-high fence or higher at the corner of a street, an actual street, not their version of a street, but an actual street, and a lane, an alleyway, exists all over this city. There are numerous homes, and I will try and show you just a few. I'm scrolling through this thing with bad vision. Let's see. How do we get this thing to move? Yeah, there we go. First of all, I want to point out, this is the condition of Community Lane and Newell Road at the time that my clients bought the property. There was a 6-foot-high fence on that corner at that time. This is 1008 Bryant, and I actually have a better picture that I'd like to pass to you. These are measurements of fences along streets. That post that the gentleman is holding has a marker at 6 feet and 7 feet. And this is all laid out in our PowerPoint deck that I believe you all have a hard copy of. This is, let's see. Look at, these are all homes in similar condition with similar fencing all around them. And I apologize, I cannot find the one we're looking for. Here it is. 1160 Ramona Street is actually 1160 Bryant Street. I have a correction page for this. That is the corner of what is identified as, I believe, 69 Lane. I'm going to pass around, if I can, hard copies I printed out of Google Street Views of these fences so you can get a better orientation of that street, Bryant. It's actually Kingsley and this 69 East Lane. It's a little lane. These are lanes that will only accommodate one car in one direction at a time. And by their definition, by the city's definition, it's an alley. Last point I want to make here before my client has a chance to speak with you, aside from the fact that this condition exists all over the city. And I can't get this to go backwards. There we go. These are the crime reports for the immediate area. They live near Highway 101 and Embarcadero. We all know where the Rinconada Library is and those tennis courts. And that's our next slide. These are all the public facilities around this property. So aside from the fact that this is a back-to-back lot, because Community Lane's not a street, aside from the fact that planning has misinterpreted the city's code and therefore does not apply, this property is entitled to an accommodation, a variance, because unlike many properties in the city, it is surrounded by all of these public facilities. You see in these pictures that it backs right into the tennis court. It is right across, directly across from Rinconada Library. A 4-foot-high fence along Newell Road makes no sense given the exposure to all of these public locations. I don't know of any homeowner in this city that would not ask for a variance along Newell Road that faces out to a public parking lot. So all we heard was Vision Triangle relying exclusively on a municipal code that I'd be interested to hear from the city attorney on, because it simply does not apply according to my reading. And the rest of the variance is necessary here given the unique location of this property. And that was not addressed. And the fact that I can show you with my handouts, with any drive around town and the slides that we've provided you, multiple homes with fencing all around these busier streets. Multiple homes with 6-foot high or higher fencing right along the corner of a lane, not a street, and a street. So this is the condition, and the reason why this is allowed at 1008 Bryant, the reason why, Byron, excuse me, the reason why it's allowed at 1160 Bryant is because at that time, the city interpreted their own code correctly. They correctly understood that the lane was not a street improved for vehicular traffic. And so it does not apply. And I will pass out some further views so you can get a better orientation of other locations in the city that have this condition. Thanks.
I'm sorry, is your client going to address the commission?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, my name is Cindy Zhang, homeowner of 1210 Newell Road. And my husband, George Chu, he is listening in from Shanghai, China now. You know, I have my cell phone, connected with him. We moved to Silicon Valley like 25 years ago, and we made it our home ever since then. We really enjoyed it. 1210 Newell Road was purchased in August 2013. The 6-foot fence was there when we bought the property. We then hired Roger Kohler's team to design a new home for our family. During the design stage, no one questioned anything about fence height. I expected a 6-foot fence would be there. Therefore, we made two very important decisions based on that. First, we relocate the driveway from facing Recanata Library on the Newell Road to the alley facing the tennis courts because it was for privacy purpose. I didn't want people to peek into our backyard whenever we drive in our vehicle or we drive the vehicle out of our garage. And then the second decision, with Mr. Kohler's advice and then the design expertise, we used a lot of large glass patio doors because we want to be able to enjoy the outdoor living with the 6-foot fence being there. And we always made it very clear to the city, the fence, about we won't change the 6-foot fence. Privacy, safety, security are extremely important for us. I guess, it's the same for all of you, everybody here. We have 3 children, 1 daughter, 2 younger boys. My husband does not live with us for most of the time. When we started on the journey to build this new home, about 5 years ago, my kids only 11, 9, and 8 years old. As you can imagine, myself alone with 3 young kids, we needed very, very much extra sense of security. And I still could not, express how much shock when I first learned there is, code violation on this fence when I received that notice from the city. They're talking about vision triangle on the rear corner where the community lane meets the newer road. And then they insisted on we lower the fence height to 3 feet. 3 feet means like, this height. And then our rear side, just assume this is the lot, our rear side, 65 feet. And then 35 feet means this much. You cut in, and the 3 feet along the community lane, 35 feet long, and 35 feet long along newer road. Only 3 feet fence. This is absolutely just, literally no fence. Open backyard. It almost like, just, give me enormous pressure. I had many, many sleepless nights. I still have a, sleeping difficulty. And then many times, I crying to my husband. Had I known this, I wouldn't consider relocating the driveway. We would keep the garage, outside to get more privacy. Also, even had I known this, I wouldn't even consider to buy this property because of this. I didn't expect, we have no privacy, just a house exposed to the public facility and then public roads. And another thing, I would like to challenge.
Please just finish and
Sure.
be judicious with your time.
The height of the fence measurement. I have totally different, opinion with what the city stated here from planning. For example, they say the interior fence height between my home and then my neighbor, Mr. Joe is my next door neighbor, is 7 feet 5 inches. But, I think they must make it wrong. This is the fence. This is a 6-foot marker, 7-foot marker. And I think we all can see this is not 7.5. And talking about a front-facing fence, 7 foot 5 inches. Again, this is our front yard, 6 foot. This is with the lattice, 1 foot. Without it, not even 6. With this, about, 6, maybe 9, 6, 8, that's it. So even on the street, like a new road side.
If you could wrap up your comments, we're
Yes.
a little over. What's
Sure.
allowable?
My point is here, on all 4 sides, the measurement stated here is incorrect. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. So I think before we go into public hearing, I have 3 comment cards from Mr. Calla, Mr. Longstaff, and Mr. Keppel. But any specific questions from commissioners on the content from staff?
And I just might also suggest that I don't think we've done disclosures yet, too. So did you do?
We did not, and we can say that this is a quasi-judicial item, and that we do need to do disclosures, but maybe we can have questions first, just because I had already. Any specific questions?
Are these to staff?
Correct, to staff.
Does that include Albert?
How was that?
Does that include Albert?
That's correct.
I do, I have a question.
Yeah, Commissioner Rupafar.
Okay. So I have some questions for the city attorney. I want to make sure I fully understand this. The fence heights, the regulations that we're looking at, it's not only based on the site triangle where it's not in compliance, there are also additional code requirements, right, for the remainder of the parcel? So it's on 2 bases. It's on the basis of the side triangle and on the basis of the remaining fence around the property?
That's correct. The request for the variance is to allow
additional height on all around the property in addition to allowing
The variance
a
on the
fence
site.
in the site triangle area.
Go ahead.
Are you finished, Commissioner Rebar? Commissioner Lowing and then Commissioner Templeton.
Would you remind us of the lattice on top of fences, that regulation compared to the actual fence? Is that a freebie or does that count as part of the fence? I don't recall that.
So the lattice is considered part of the fence structure.
Okay, I didn't recall that. Is it staff's interpretation that the purported existing 6-foot fence that was there to begin with is now sort of overruled because it's an entirely new property as opposed to a remodeled property, so that it might be grandfathered in?
There are several, fences don't require a planning permit or a building permit. They just are required to adhere to the code. And so there are several illegal fences throughout the city. So that is likely the case here for the existing fence that was there prior to the house.
Okay, so you're saying there's no difference because they put up a new house as opposed to a remodeled house, they just happen to have an illegal illegal fence when they moved in?
Correct.
You're saying. Okay. That's it for now.
All right, Commissioner Templeton, and then Commissioner Wolfvogel and Commissioner Walczak. I'll remind you that we still have a hearing to go through as well, commissioners.
I wanted to ask, well, I'm trying to figure out, you're trying to segment our comments, so I have questions of staff. Can you clarify what you want before and what you want after?
I'd like detailed questions and clarifications based on the presentations. I'd like to please withhold your dialogue until later if you can.
Okay.
Sorry if I can interrupt. You know, if we're going to get into these sorts of questions, I'd like to do the disclosures first, if you don't mind.
That's fine, we can do disclosures. Let's start with Commissioner Wolfvogel, if you don't mind.
I drove past the property after I saw the packet.
Yeah, I went and looked at the property, and I also looked at the history of the property on Google Maps.
No disclosures?
Nothing disclosed.
Yeah, just for clarification, it's not a disclosure if you visited the property. I had no contacts with the applicant, and I don't live near the applicant.
No disclosures.
No disclosures.
Commissioner Templeton.
Could you clarify whether this property was inspected when it was being built?
So this is a two-story house that went through our individual review process. So the house itself would have been inspected prior to occupancy.
And did it pass inspection?
Yes, it would have had to be occupied.
Was the fence on the site at the time?
That's the information that I do not know.
Okay, and what can you tell me about the difference between a street and a lane and a driveway, or is that discussion? Billy, you're pulling your hair over here, so do you want me to wait for this kind of question?
If you all would prefer, we're having the dialogue that we need to have after the hearing. I'd prefer to
right.
maybe just withdraw these comments unless there's really specific questions on what was presented. I think that
These are all relevant, but it's...
I'm not disagreeing they're relevant, but I think that we need to hear from the public. And if you have something specific,
Yeah, some specific
please.
technical question.
Yeah.
You can defer it if you wish. Just to remind us the definition of natural grade.
Commissioner Suma.
I can wait.
Commissioner Olczyk?
Yep, same, I'll wait.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to, I think we should need to open the public hearing and then hear from the public. Maybe we can hear from John Calla first. And after John Calla, Derek Longstaff.
Good evening. My name is John Calla. I live at 1420 Parkinson Avenue, which is 2 houses down from 1210 Newell. I'll keep my comments very brief in respect of your time. First off, we had a lot of discussion in the earlier presentations about the fence height. I would remind you, all of the fences, every bit of the fence is above the allowed height, notwithstanding that side discussion about the triangle. I've written in objection to that. I don't like the fortress feel that it creates for the neighborhood. Several of my other neighbors have written to that effect as well. And in your packet, I see that there are other neighbors that are more sympathetic and support the fences. So you have a mixed view in the neighborhood. I've spoken out against it because it creates a fortress. Secondly, with respect to the alleyway and how you, I'll leave the legal interpretation of what might come to bear there. I drive down that alley every day. My driveway is on the back. My garage is there. I park in the garage. It is incredibly unsafe. There is no visual sight line for me exiting across the sidewalk onto Newell for the bikers or the pedestrians on the sidewalk. None. I cannot see until I've actually crossed the sidewalk because of that. Those of you that are familiar, you'll know that Newell is a main transport road for the kids riding their bikes down to Green Middle School in the morning. So in addition to the cars and the safety of the cars, you've got the issues of the sidewalk and the pedestrians and the bicyclists on the sidewalk. I don't know if that's relevant legally, but I'm just offering that point of view and speaking out against it. Lastly, if you were to ask the homeowner to produce the records from the fence building company and the invoices there, you will find that the fence was constructed 3 days after the final site inspection. Thank you.
Mr. Longstaff.
So, yeah, this is the,
All right, okay, sorry.
yeah, unless there's another public speaker, and then the applicant would have a chance to rebut.
Mr. Coble.
Good evening. My name is Joseph Keogh. I live at 1430 Parkinson Avenue, and I'm the abutting neighbor to Cindy's property. There are a couple of issues here that I think are important to understand. One is, as I read through the documents that were presented here today, what I didn't note was the unique nature of the property 1210 Newell in conjunction to those other public facilities that were shown up on the slide. The key thing there is that the library is directly across the street, the Palo Alto Art Center is next door to that, and then the tennis courts are behind us. To give you some kind of understanding of what this means, as I've looked at data for 2017, there were 24,000 visits, separate visits to that library that walks along that line that their property fronts. There are 10,000 people who attend certain events at the Palo Alto Art Center, including the glass and the pumpkin glass displays that are there. That's not even counting the people from the tennis courts, the park that's there. And often I've gone in the back there while that house is being constructed and encountered individuals who really clearly shouldn't have been there. As I've mentioned before to many neighbors, that I've run into people dumping garbage back there and people who really shouldn't be there. So they do present a different security risk than is presented in the documents here, and it really needs to be taken into account. While that house was down, I was the frontage property to Newell. And I saw many things that were very disturbing from a point of view of privacy, security, and quiet enjoyment of my property. We can't take a cookie-cutter approach to these things, and the variance is put there for a specific reason, and that is, if you have an exceptional property, you have to make an exceptional remedy. And in this particular case, I think they have warranted that. I think they've demonstrated that. While there's an issue with respect to that community lane, it really has to be looked at from its overall safety perspective. I don't think you could find anyone on that block who could tell you what direction you drive on that lane. I will tell you one thing, a simple inspection of that will show a stop sign at one end on Pine Street. No stop end on the side facing Newell. I'm not even sure you're supposed to be able to drive out there. even if that was the case, the stop sign and the vegetation at the end of the alley on Pine Street blocks the view as well. There's no triangle sight. There's no sight there. You have to do the same thing you do all the time in an alley. Proceed at around 5 to 11 miles an hour and be very cautious as you move forward for the reasons that John stated, that there are bicycles, that there are kids, and there are all kinds of people there. If they did take down that fence at that area there, they still have a sight angle problem because there's vegetation that I believe the city owns that presents a similar blockage that was up on Mr. Gutierrez's slide over there when he showed the picture. If you didn't notice it because he might have been pointing to the line site, the vegetation is there. That would have to be dealt with. I'm very concerned about vehicular traffic and people and injuries and those kind of things. And one of the things that I think would be, whatever happens to this particular case, there needs to be a mirror put up there or a one-way directional sign or something to tell the public when they're driving in there which way to drive down there, how to proceed safely, because it does require some type of a mirror even if you took down the fence. That fence removal is not going to change that issue.
Okay,
so
thanks.
I'd like to conclude my comments and thank you for listening.
Okay, that concludes our hearing. Unless the applicant would like to make another statement.
Very briefly, 'cause I just want to correct a couple of things.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Longstaff. Go ahead.
We have in the package you got from the applicant slides 53, 54, 55. So one of the earlier speakers, John, I think, said that the fence was put up 3 days after final inspection, and he'd like to see the contractor's records. We already provided that. The fence was up about 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the final inspection. It was there. So those slides make it clear. My client took a cell phone picture, just happened to take a picture of her kitchen. So you could see, go back one, please. Thank you. The final inspection is 6/14/2018. And then the next slide is the picture out of her window, and that's the fence that's already there. And the next, that's 6/6. These are the canceled checks. She paid him half when he started the job and half when he finished the job. So that's May 31st. So it was present prior to the final inspection. And there are other slides in the deck that make clear that the 6-foot-high fence along Newell was always in the plans. These are plans that the neighborhood would have had a chance to speak about. These are plans that the city reviewed. These are plans the city approved. And they designed and built their house with a lot of glass based upon those approvals. So we did cite some case authority. I will be the first to admit it's not a slam dunk legally, but there is some good case law out there that once the city has blessed the mess, they have to sort of live with it. So in this sense, the 6-foot-high fence in the plans should have been allowed. The lattice is probably where we're getting some differences in measurements between the two sides. But this conversation about it, every single fence is over the limit, it might be an interpretation based upon the lattice, which is, this commission rightfully pointed out, is not as clear as it should be in the code about the lattice. I think you need to clean that. Ideally, that would be cleaned up. But in reliance upon that and in reliance upon the architect advising them at the time, they built it the right way. And lastly, I'm sorry to hear that the community lane, the little alleyway, is somehow dangerous. That's unfortunate, and it's unfortunate to a mother of 3 kids that lives right there. It's also the case that that's been the situation for a long time, a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the public hearing. We'll bring it back to the commission. Before we do that, there were 2 things that came out in the pre-meeting yesterday, Mr. Gutierrez and Ms. Gerhardt, that I think would just like you to mention. You mentioned yesterday to Vice Chair Alchik and I that code compliance is complaint-based, and I wonder if you could speak to that. And then also, how we should treat a quasi-judicial item, and that it's judging the property against the code, not against other properties. And I was hoping you could speak to both those items, and Director Layat and Albert, you would like to speak to that too, but I think that would help us direct our discussion a little better.
Yes, so code enforcement is in the city and operated under a complaint-based system. So you would need to submit a formal complaint to code enforcement for us to initiate code enforcement action. That's typically done through the 311 system or contacting a code enforcement officer via their email. And even at times a planner, you say, this is a possible violation, I suspect it, I've observed it at this address on this date. A lot of times they submit photos of that, and then we would proceed with a code enforcement investigation to first see if that is the case. I mean, the code is dense, so sometimes what may be perceived as a code enforcement violation isn't actually that. So we do confirm that first, and then after we do a confirmation, we inform the complainant there is or there isn't, and then we inform the subject property owner wherever the infraction lies.
Right, and so with respect to the subject application, it's true. There may be other properties that have non-complying illegal fences. We don't know. Like Sam noted, our code enforcement is a complaint-driven effort at this time. And for your consideration, when you're reviewing this variance request, it's on the findings, and the findings are pretty clear as to what the standard for review is. And maybe, Sam, can we get those findings back on the board for the commission? And in this, as you review the findings for this, it does not include any sort of reference to existing conditions of other properties. That's not a standard for your review. These are the special circumstances that apply to the property that deprive the owner of privileges enjoyed by other properties in the same district. And you can review the other ones, that the granting of the application would not constitute a special privilege to this owner and not others, or would be detrimental, injurious to the property, public health, safety, general welfare, or convenience. And all three of these would have to be answered in the affirmative to grant the variance. And one area where I think we get very clearly have a concern is with respect to the visual triangle that we're trying to maintain, so that pedestrian, bicycle, and motor conflicts can be reduced or eliminated with the inclusion of that provision. And we have other references in our zoning code, in our municipal code, that speaks to what a street is, and a street does include, by definition, an alley. And so we feel like in this particular area in particular that we're not able to support the variance findings, but of course that's before the commission now.
Okay, thanks for that framework. I think that was somewhat lost, and not, Sam, you're great. Your presentation was great. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't lost. So if my commissioners don't mind, I want to start in a different way. I know Commissioner Templeton, said you had a lot of comments. So if you don't mind, we'll start with Commissioner Templeton and Commissioner Suma, and then Commissioner Wolfvogel, and then we'll do the same on this side. Any questions, comments? Let's just keep it moving.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I did want to talk, I had some questions about the selective enforcement process. You said that's complaint-driven. Are there any other factors that a process you go through to ensure that it's not somehow biased?
Well, somehow not what?
Biased.
Yeah, well, I would say that it's not selective, it's complaint-driven. When we receive a complaint, we send an
That is a selection criteria, right? That's the selection criteria, is what you're saying.
I'm distinguishing complaint-driven from proactive, where if we find a violation, we would follow up on it. We're simply not staffed for that. I mean, we have 3 positions in total in the city, and 2 of them are vacant right now. So especially at this point in time, we're only able to respond to complaints that come in.
Okay, thank you. And regarding the measurement accuracy, can you clarify, one of the applicants mentioned a discrepancy between the measurements?
Yes, so I believe that they didn't include the lattice as a part of the fence because it's a separate structure that's bolted on, but we do include anything that's attached to the top of the fence that is structural to be a part of the fence. So this could be a decorative light that's on top of the fence. That is the totality of the fence from the ground up.
But in the photo, it looked like the pole that she was holding it was right, the lattice was present. Is that, do you have any other measurement?
I don't know how they measured that. I'm not sure if that was 6 feet. When this all started, this was, again, with the code enforcement case, and the code enforcement officer at the time did take measurements of the fence from the public right-of-way.
Okay. And did you discuss as part of your alternative ways of dealing with this case, did you talk about removing the lattice?
The lattice and bringing down the fence height to the proper code height, which would be 4 feet along Newell. So that was discussed. And then, like I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we discussed the privacy factor, which then was you could plant hedges and shrubs. There's a number of properties that do this. They have a smaller fence, and then they have dense vegetation as a privacy buffer, sound buffer as well. So those are the options that were discussed.
And for the site triangle, did you discuss alternatives like mirrors or other ways of handling the safety of that intersection that didn't involve
So the mirrors
through the backyard?
Aren't something that's referenced in the code.
Okay.
So that wouldn't be something that's applicable.
Okay. And inspecting the fence height of adjoining properties is out of scope? Is that what you were saying earlier?
Correct. It wouldn't be something that we would look at for code enforcement, nor would it be something during the variance application. That's not a part of the
How does that relate to the finding here about the enjoying the property with the privileges that the other properties have? How does that, I don't know if that's an Albert question or...
I think what you need to look at is a couple of factors. One is our city does have different regulations for corner properties. And so I think if you are looking at how the regulations apply to other corner properties in the same zoning district with the same conditions, I think that might be a measure of standard to look at. And in that context, all of those properties are subject to the same standards.
Is the property on the other end of the block, does that have a 35-foot triangle, site triangle?
I don't know the reference.
Which block would you be talking about? Community Lane or Newell?
Community, the block that the subject property, the applicant. So here's the applicant. Does this one have a 35-foot line of sight triangle?
At their corner of Newell and Pine, I'm not aware of their situation. Because if you're speaking to the Newell and Pine intersection, the one that you pointed to in the top left, that one is different in the sense of
I mean the one on Community Lane, on the same block that the house is on? Maybe
So
if we brought up the picture.
we'll get the neighborhood diagram up here, but I think you're talking about the other end of Community Lane, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so in that, that particular house is facing in a different direction. So it actually has its front setback. I'm not sure what that street is.
I'm just wondering about the Community Lane corner, if that...
Yeah, so it has a very low fence. I've got it up on Google Maps, but it's a very low, either 3 or 4 foot fence. I can't tell from the diagram.
Great, thank you. I think that's everything I had. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Suma.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, and thank you for the staff report. I thought the findings were very thoroughly and nicely made. I did have a question on packet page 43, and it relates to some of the discussion from the attorney. And this is, I guess, maybe an Albert and Jonathan question, but it's not my impression that an approved permit or an approved inspection gives you the right to not be in compliance with the law based on, would that be accurate?
That's correct. So even if a permit is issued in error, or there's a final inspection that's approved in error, that does not, provide any right to continue that condition.
Okay, thank you for that. And does staff have any observation on the placement of garages in general on this block? Because it seems to me like they're mostly in the back, and maybe they would have been required to comply with that law and put it in the back on the alley anyway. Does staff have an opinion on that?
So that would have been reviewed during the IR process, and I think for the purpose of this variance, I don't think we've done any analysis as to the context-based garage placement.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
I mean, we could,
all the other garages are in the back on that block.
yeah,
So-
we could probably do some, quick work on that, but
No, I was just curious if, you don't have to do any more work on it. I was curious. It did appear to be the pattern on that block. So, and I have always thought in the code that it was clear that we treat alleys like streets. It's in the definition in Title I makes that very clear. And the definition in the other place, I forget where it is, Title 21, is considering this with regards to the Subdivision Map Act, which I think is a different context. And it clearly, in that title, it clearly says alley is a private alley, and since this is a public alley, I don't see that that's very pertinent in this situation. And I think that the safety issue at corners is a very real consideration. So those are my thoughts for now.
Commissioner Walfogel?
Thank you. I think there are two issues here, so I'll just take them one at a time. First one is the intersection view triangle situation. So if this is an intersection, then my understanding is we have no ability to make allow variance. Is that correct? So is there any way, I heard an interesting suggestion from the public that if Community Lane were one way, and there was no circulation out from Community Lane to Newell, that we wouldn't encounter this situation. Would that be a possible cure if we were to one-way Community Lane? I just want to run through a hypothetical with you.
I'll look to staff to help out. I don't know that there's a distinction between in our code about whether one-way or two-way, but I'll note that, bicyclists would certainly travel, and others use the alley besides motor vehicles too. So that's something to be mindful
and I'm
about.
just looking for a possible cure. Trying to be creative, and I heard an interesting suggestion, but it sounds like it may not be doable. I mean, unless you have some other idea.
Yeah, so there's no distinction in our code today. Maybe a future
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's maybe something we could, make a note on as we look at code cleanups, sometime in the future. And then I think beyond this, the fence code is pretty clear. I think that your analysis is pretty straightforward, and I don't really understand why there's so much ambiguity here. I mean, the code is pretty clear about 4 feet, 6 feet. Subject to this natural grade question, is natural grade from the street grade, or is that from the improved grade when you measure fence height?
Yeah, typically from the grade adjacent to the fence.
Adjacent to the fence?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can, and you're allowed to, I think you're allowed to fill by some amount, 6 inches or 12 inches from.
So what we do is we get a survey typically for a new home, and so we have a topo survey that reveals what the grade is at that particular location, and we measure and extrapolate from that.
Okay, so we're not measuring from sidewalk grade to top of fence?
No.
Yeah, I just want to be clear on what the standard is.
Correct.
Please. I think that Mr. Gutierrez has a comment here.
I don't know if the public, though.
Anything to add? That's all I have.
All right, Commissioner Olczyk?
Actually, can you come back to me?
Commissioner Rupavar?
Sure. I just echo Commissioner Stuma and Walfogel's sentiments. I feel the packet is pretty clear. This is a pretty clear-cut issue to me. I'll just say right now, I cannot make the findings. Variances require a uniqueness of the property that's inherent in the physical, how it physically is. This is not a situation like that. And granting a variance in this instance would be a special privilege, without a doubt. Variances aren't created to whoever doesn't like the code to come in and say, hey, can you cut me a break here? The fact that other neighbors are not complying with the law doesn't make it okay in this instance. And I mean, that's pretty much what I have to say. I do feel a lot of empathy for the homeowner and what they're going through. I just don't think, I think our hands are tied in this instance, and I don't think a variance is the appropriate mechanism by which to accomplish what they're trying to achieve.
Commissioner Loewen?
Just a couple comments, and I won't repeat prior colleagues' comments. It is odd and unfortunate that the building inspector didn't catch something that's, to me, as obvious as the height of a fence, but he didn't. So that doesn't change the status of the law. I'm not convinced that a 6-foot fence is much more or less safe than a 4-foot fence, but that's not in our finding anyway. And as the applicant heard, there's almost no constraints outside of the vision triangle on landscaping. So you could build something that's 15 feet tall as long as it doesn't interfere on the corners, which is quite an effective natural remedy. So I'm in support of the staff recommendation.
Commissioner Olczyk?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for your comments and your presentation. So I had a couple questions. I don't know, look, I think there is some uniqueness here. I think strict application of our zoning regulations do suggest that there's a substantial hardship here. I think, I guess I have a couple questions about, well, let's start with this. I'm not entirely sure that I can make the findings for variance either. But I am curious to know, what is the path a resident should take legally if they disagree with an interpretation by the planning department, say with respect to whether this road is for vehicular traffic as opposed to whether it qualifies as a lane, which is not the word we used in section 040. And what would the path be for an applicant who wished to challenge an interpretation they think is wrong?
So for zoning code interpretations, we do have a process to ask the director to issue a formal interpretation, and then there's something that can follow on from there. For issues outside of the zoning code, we don't have similar provisions. In this instance, where the dispute was initiated through a code enforcement action, the property owner could request a hearing before an administrative hearing officer over the validity of that code violation. And that's an area where you could argue the interpretation of the code. And then from there, once that administrative process is over, you could seek judicial review.
Okay. I think there may be some relevance to the suggestion that I think there's when you look at it and you try to consider whether there's some legal significance to the argument that the interpretation may be wrong, sort of changes things. If we were to look at this intersection as something less than the type of intersection that rises to the level defined in 040, then maybe that would change how you could have the code applied to the corner. And so I think that doesn't necessarily address what happens along Newell Road, which is sort of different. I think that to some extent, the path for the interpretation argument might need to go down a different road. I am a little, I'm not excited about reviewing this when there's like what seems like very differing measurements. It didn't occur to me to take my own measuring tape out there. I didn't anticipate actually that the owner would suggest that our measurements were off. I don't believe that you came here with the wrong information as a California licensed attorney. So I really wonder if maybe ahead of the city council meeting, you ought to go out there yourself before you make the presentation and double check, maybe even meet the applicant and check the measurements. Because if, as the pictures demonstrated, not very many of the fences are even rising above 6 feet or 7 feet, then it would be, I think it would be better. I just think it would lend credibility to the sort of staff's assessment. I agree with other commissioners on the points they made. I have a question. Would it change if the fence wasn't solid, if they use a metal railing fence along Newell?
No, it would be the same.
I think the thing I'm struggling with the most here is that we sort of are acknowledging that they could create a landscaped barrier that would impede visual sight almost entirely, and that may not necessarily, like if they planted hedges along Newell, they could theoretically be much higher than 4 feet.
They could, and everyone could do that because we do not regulate the height of the vegetation outside of that site triangle. So you could plant cypress trees along behind the code compliant fence and have, cypress trees grow up to 20 feet and more, for example. The one regulation the one thing that you couldn't do is have vegetation that overgrows into the public right-of-way, blocking the sidewalk.
Yeah, no, there's some components of this that are, that seem, well, whatever. So I guess my only statement would be that I don't know that we can make the findings for a variance. I think that there may be a pathway with respect to the interpretation argument on the rear, which would change the rear triangle. But I think in any case, I wonder if we could encourage staff to also consider when we looked at the picture of that, if you wouldn't mind putting that picture up.
Which photo?
Of that path, that lane, that alley with the, so there's a pole there. I'm wondering if it would be possible for the city to also consider the addition of a mirror, just because I guess both sides of the table sort of talked about it, and seems like it would be a good addition. And then I guess the last thing is, to what extent is it, I guess since you're already aware of this particular entrance, there's two sides to the street. Is the other side in compliance? Are we?
Yes, the other end of, we were talking to Commissioner Templeton, the other end of it has a front setback and it has a lower fence.
Do we know why this side doesn't have a stop sign if the other side does? Is there any?
Oh, and I didn't mean stop sign, I meant at lower fences. The other end of Community Lane has lower fences.
Right. And is there any information on why one side has a stop sign and the other side doesn't? Was this supposed to?
I can answer that question. You need 1,500 trips to warrant a stop sign. The other side doesn't warrant a stop sign either.
We don't have that information, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to educate you.
Educate us.
Appreciate it. Okay. That's all I got. Oh, wait, I'll add one more thing. I think with respect to what you asked about, I think it's different for corner lots because the front of this lot is not Newell or this lane. It's I know the address says 1210 Newell, but the frontage of this is actually on a different street, right?
Correct, it's on
Yeah.
Parkinson.
So any location actually along Newell would have not been considered front for a corner lot, with respect to your question about the location of the driveway. And then the car parking, yeah, it wouldn't have changed. They wouldn't have been restricted to have access to the location of the parking facility along Newell, because that's not considered a front street.
It was before.
Right, no, I know. I'm saying you could have accessed a rear parking facility on Newell, regardless of the predominance of parking facilities on that street, because it's not the front, it's a side street. So even if the...
I'm sorry, it's just not relevant to the variance.
No, I know, but it is, I'll say this, we should have some sympathy for the fact that maybe when the original survey was done, it likely showed, before they submitted their plans, it likely showed a 6-foot fence, an existing 6-foot fence.
But I think Commissioner,
So to the extent that they may not have known that that may have changed the way they designed their lot. I think there's some, if they would have had to relocate their driveway to the rear anyways and they knew it, then that's a different story. But in this case, I think I'm just trying to address what Commissioner Suma was saying.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, would anyone entertain a motion? Commissioner Suma?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to move staff's recommendation on the basis of the findings.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion of the motion on the floor? Seeing none, let's just take a vote. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries 7-0. That concludes that hearing. The next item, item 4, approval of minutes. Public comment permitted. Any comments on the minutes? I have no cards. Okay. Seeing that, all in favor of approving the minutes? Yeah, motion by the chair. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. No committee items to report unless, Commissioner Suma, you have any updates from Ventura? Okay, so no updates from Ventura. Comments, questions, announcements, and future agenda items. Can you give us a little bit of a look ahead as a commission?
Your next meeting is canceled.
That's right. So no meeting on the 24th.
Yeah, we got to.
But in terms of agenda for May 10th and May 29th?
Yeah, so May 8th, right, is your next one after that, and it's your one of these evergreen reports that we'll produce. It's an annual review of the comprehensive plan consistency review of the capital improvement plan program.
Whatever you just said.
Yeah. So that's forthcoming, and then we have a couple other items soon. I don't have a date for it yet, but soon we're anticipating Castellea to be an item that will be before the commission. So that will be.
And I think a number of us had asked to see the DEIR
right.
early and often on that one.
Once it's ready, we'll push it out to the commission.
Any other announcements, okay. Commissioner Suma.
I was going to ask, at the retreat, we didn't really lay out a process for doing these, the presentation type meetings. Should we do that so we don't run into a last minute change again? Should we agendize it and do it, or?
Well, I think what I suggest is if any of you have suggestions or you want to point me to people that you think will be straight up awesome, which 2 people have already, we can figure out when we can get them on the agenda when we have holes. What occurred today was that a little bit of oversight. So maybe Albert.
Staff failed to properly notice the item to allow the speaker to come and present. So it was an error in the way the agenda was published.
But I was just wondering if we need to have a discussion about, like, a procedure, so we're all on the same page and we know what's going on with these meetings as they pop up. That's what I was thinking about.
I mean, I took it as kind of one of the responsibilities that you all gave me to try to bring in some people that were doing creative stuff to educate our community and each other. So I think, Commissioner Walfogel's made some suggestions on like some topics that he's challenged me to bring some folks in. Commissioner Alchek had some ideas. So I'm just trying to do some recruitment more than anything. So if you want to, I think we should just dialogue it, and I don't know that we need another separate process to figure out how to set our agendas.
So then maybe as these people are brought to your attention, and if you're planning on having such a meeting, just shoot it out to staff so they can send it to all of us so we can make suggestions on the meeting. I don't even know what was really being planned for tonight, but
Yeah,
so
I
that
mean,
we
that-
can all have input, since it's a kind of commission-driven instead of staff-driven agenda item.
Yeah, I think I can do a better job of letting staff let you all know what the intent and what the goal of it is. I think it's fine. That's great. And I would just say, if you know of people doing interesting stuff, like for example, we talked a lot about teacher housing and how we could figure out teacher housing solutions to workforce housing for our civic employees. And Vice Chair also happened to run into someone that's doing exactly that last week, that's trying to facilitate teacher housing in our region, and I think might be a really good person to come talk to us about some creative solutions in that space. So let me know if you have ideas.
What about just the gentleman you were going to have tonight? We got some openings in our agenda going forward. Can we get that person on pretty quickly?
Yeah, I asked him for another day, and I'm going to suggest we do it on the 29th if we still have space in our agenda, and we'll have a little more information about that as it comes. Right, anything else? All right. Seeing none, it is 7:29, and we are adjourned.